Last Saturday, or last night, at sundown, as we began our observance of the Sabbath, Orthodox Jews around the world began not only the observance of the Sabbath, but they began an occasion that has been observed by them as a national community for many, many centuries. They began a fast that is known as the Fast of Ab, A-B. Now, Ab is the fifth month of the sacred calendar, the Hebrew calendar. Last night at sundown began the 9th day of the fifth month of the sacred calendar. We're that means, of course, we're less than 2 months away from the first day of the seventh month, which, of course, is the Feast of Trumpets. But we are and have been for a little over a week in the fifth month of the sacred calendar, and last night at sundown began the 9th day of the fifth month, and this is a day that for about 25 centuries, the Jews have taken upon themselves to fast on a day that they called the Fast of Ab. Now, there is a particular reason for that. It is not an occasion that is commanded in the Bible. It is not something that the church has traditionally observed. It is not something that is commanded in Leviticus chapter 23 with the festivals of God. But it is a day that the Jews have taken upon themselves for very specific reasons. Reasons which have an application to us today. And it is, I think, appropriate that as we are here on a Sabbath, that is a Sabbath, it is also the 9th day of the fifth month, that we should take note of that occasion, of a particular book in the Bible that is specifically read on this occasion in the synagogues around the world, and understand that there is a very specific lesson for us. In fact, there's more than one lesson that we can derive from this. Now, the Jews fast on the 9th day of the fifth month because that day is an anniversary of a very terrible event. Let's turn in our Bibles back to 2 Kings. And 2 Kings chapter 25, the very last chapter of the book of 2 Kings. And we read here, speaking of King Zedekiah, well, let's pick it up in 2 Kings 24. We'll pick up about the last few verses of 2 Kings 24. Begin in verse 17 of 2 Kings 24, sort of get the background, the setting. The king of Babylon made Mattaniah, his father's brother, king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. So Zedekiah was king in Jerusalem from the age of 21 until the age of 32. He was a young man. He was the last king of Judah, the last king to reign on the throne of David in Jerusalem. He was 21 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Eternal, according to all that Jehoiakim, his uncle, had done. And through the anger of the Eternal, it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, and the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his host, against Jerusalem, and he pitched against it, and they built forts against it round about. And the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So the city was besieged for just under 2 years. It was besieged for a little over 18 months. And on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine prevailed in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the land. So for a period of over a year, in fact, Zedekiah thought that he had made great preparation. Foodstuffs had been stored up, had been laid up. But the siege continued and continued week after week, month after month. And a year went by, and 13, 14, 15 months. Finally, the 4th month, which would have been, let's say, it would have been a month ago. We're here in the latter part of July. This would have been in perhaps the mid part of June, that a famine began in the city. There was no bread. The storehouses were empty. There was no more food. And the city was broken up. And all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between two walls, which is by the king's garden. Now the Chaldees were against the city round about, and the king went the way toward the plain. And the army of the Chaldeans pursued after the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army were scattered from him. And they took the king, and they brought him unto the king. They brought him to the king of Babylon, to Riblah, and they gave judgment against him. And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. So his little children, his little boys, were murdered right there as he looked. And then they put out the eyes of Zedekiah. The last thing he saw was the death of his sons. And then they gouged his eyes out. They bound him with fetters of brass, and they carried him to Babylon. And in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which is the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. So 2 days ago marked the anniversary of the walls of Jerusalem being breached. And for the next 3 days, there was wholesale looting that went on, complete and total destruction, as much as what an army that was there was capable of doing. They had been holding a siege against the city of Jerusalem for 18 months. Finally, on the 7th day of the 5th month, they breached the walls. They came in, and they began the pillage and the rape and the looting of the city. They burnt the house of the Eternal, verse 9, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house burnt he with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls of Jerusalem round about. The rest of the people that were left in the city, and the fugitives that fell away to the king of Babylon with the remnant of the multitude, did Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away. But the captain of the guard left of the poor of the land to be vine dressers and husbandmen. The pillars of brass that were in the house of the Eternal, and the bases and the brazen sea that was in the house of the Eternal, did the Chaldeans break in pieces and carry the brass to Babylon. The pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the spoons and all the vessels of brass wherewith they ministered took they away, and the fire pans and the bowls and such things as were of gold and silver the captain of the guard took away. All of the things that Solomon had made for the house of the Lord. The brass of these vessels was without weight. It goes on and describes the pillars of the temple. And they took these things, and they took them away. Now, this looting took place over a period of time. The walls were breached on the 7th day of the 7th day of the 5th month. According to Jewish tradition, it was 2 days later, on the 9th day of the 5th month, that the temple of Solomon was set on fire and burned to the ground. The 9th day of the 5th month obviously came to symbolize for the Jews the destruction of everything that was important to them. It was the destruction of that which symbolized their greatness as a people. It symbolized their independence. It symbolized both their religion and their nation. It symbolized the end of freedom and independence, the beginning of slavery and servitude. Now, this event that occurred on the 9th day of the 5th month, this destruction of the temple that Solomon built, was not a totally isolated event. There were things that preceded it that set the stage for it. Events that brought about this event. Many things that can and should be learned from it. Now, the book of Lamentations, which is the book that is traditionally read on this date, is a book that was actually written a number of years before. A number of years before. And yet, it contained information that very directly ties in with the destruction of Jerusalem at the time that this occurred, in the 11th year of King Zedekiah, on the 9th day of the 5th month. Now, ironically, 6 centuries later, it was on these same days. It was on the 9th and 10th day of the 5th month that the Roman armies in 70 A.D. reached the walls of Jerusalem and burned the second temple. The temple that Zerubbabel had built and Herod had enlarged was destroyed by the Roman armies on the anniversary of the destruction of the first temple. So that destruction in 70 A.D. marked the end of the Jewish state for almost 19 centuries. It marked the end, the complete end, of any sort of Jewish nation for a period of almost 19 centuries. It marked the beginning of total dispersion and scattering. Well, these particular destructions, these two destructions of the temple at Jerusalem, prefigured a time of destruction that is going to come, not simply to Judah and Jerusalem, but to our nations and our people. We will take note of that in a few moments in the book of Lamentations. But let's understand a little bit of what set the stage for this. Let's go back in the story and let's understand what set the stage for the writing of this book of Lamentations and for the destruction that came about. If we're to go back into the book of 2 Kings a little further, let's go back to 2 Kings chapter 21 and verse 1. We read here that Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Eternal after the abominations of the heathen, whom the Eternal cast out before the children of Israel. He built up again the high places, which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He reared up altars for Baal. He made a grove, as did Ahab king of Israel. He worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of the Eternal, of which the Eternal said, "In Jerusalem will I put my name." He built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. He made his son pass through the fire and observed times and used enchantments and dealt with familiar spirits and wizards. He wrought much wickedness in the sight of the Eternal to provoke him to anger. He set a graven image of the grove which he had made in the house, of which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, will I put my name forever. Neither will I make the feet of Israel move any more out of the land which I gave their fathers, only if they will observe to do all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they hearkened not, and Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than did the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the children of Israel." We're told that over the period of time of Manasseh's rule, that everything that God hated, Manasseh put into practice. He introduced rampant idolatry into the land. He did all sorts of things that brought things from bad to worse. The final state of things was, we're told by the end of Manasseh's reign, that the sins going on in Judah were actually worse than what the Canaanites of old had been doing, for which God had expelled them from the land. You know, frankly, brethren, when you look around and you see what's going on in this nation, you see the things that are done and the sins that are trumpeted, you would have to conclude that if God did not visit His judgment and His punishment on this nation, He certainly owes an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. Because there's nothing they did that we're not doing in this country. There was an article in the paper this morning talking about a meeting of the Episcopal House of Delegates and the House of Bishops. They had a very controversial proposal up in the Episcopal House of Bishops and House of Delegates. That controversial proposal was the fact that to condemn was to take the position that the clergy of the Episcopal Church should be banned from engaging in extramarital sex. That proposal was defeated 3-1. That was a very controversial proposal. Now, when you can't agree on something that's that simple, when you can't even agree with the seventh commandment, then you've got problems. And you certainly have no right to lay any sort of claim to the Bible being the book that is the basis of your religion. But we notice a couple of things here in 2 Kings chapter 21. We notice the extent of the sins that Manasseh led the Jews into. And we're told in verse 9 of 2 Kings 21 that Manasseh seduced them to do more evil. Inevitably, up and down over the period of history, we find the fact of people following their leaders to do evil. Manasseh seduced them into all sorts of things. Because after all, the way of the world, the way of fitting in with the world, the way of the flesh is convenient, it's comfortable, it sort of helps you fit in with everything and everyone around. In verse 12, therefore, thus says the eternal God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such evil upon Jerusalem and Judah, that whosoever hears of it, both of his ears shall tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem as a man wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. God says, I'm going to wipe it clean. We're told in verse 16, Manasseh shed innocent blood very much, till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, beside his sin which he had made Judah to sin in doing that which was evil in the sight of the Eternal. Manasseh slept with his fathers, we're told in verse 18, and Ammon his son reigned in his stead. Ammon was 22 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 2 years. In verse 20, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, as his father Manasseh did. So this added 2 years to what Manasseh had done. He walked in all the way that his father walked in, and he served the idols that his father served and worshipped them. And he forsook the eternal God of his fathers, and he walked not in the way of the eternal. And the servants of Ammon conspired against him, and they slew the king in his own house. So he was a victim of assassination. The people of the land slew all them that conspired against the king Ammon. So now we have another counter coup, coup and a counter coup. And they made Josiah, Ammon's son, king in his stead. Now, chapter 22, verse 1 tells us that Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. Here he was, just a little boy, 8 years old. began to reign. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem, so he lived to be 39 years of age. Died still in his prime. But he had a long reign, 31 years. Began when he was 8. And we're told in verse 2, he did that which was right in the sight of the Eternal, and he walked in all the way of David his father, and turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. Now, if you just hold your place there, I want to refer back to the parallel account in 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 34, we're told that Josiah, 2 Chronicles 34:1, Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. In verse 3, 2 Chronicles 34, in the 8th year of his reign, while he was yet young, he began to seek after the God of David his father, and in the 12th year he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places and the groves and the carved images and the molten images. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. By the time he turned 16, he began to seek God. He began as a young man, 15, 16 years old. He began to seek God and seek to learn about God. By the time he was 20, when he had reached full majority and was full age to reign independently of counselors and advisors, we find that the first thing he began to do was to purge Jerusalem and Judah from the high places and the groves and the carved images and the molten images. They broke down the altars of Balaam in his presence and the images that were on the high above them. I'm reading out of 2 Chronicles. He cut down the groves and the carved images and the molten images. He broke in pieces, made dust of them, and strode it upon the graves of them that had sacrificed to them. Burnt the bones of the priests upon their altar and cleansed Judah and Jerusalem. Josiah set in motion a reform and a revival. He was 20 years of age. He had begun to seek God as a teenager. Very important example for you young people. We find that many of these kings, when he was quite a contrast to his grandfather. His grandfather Manasseh had become king when he was 12. And he was a wild and woolly young fella who did not improve with age. And the situation continued to deteriorate and to degenerate. Finally, when Josiah came to the throne as a young boy, he began to orient his thinking and began to want to learn about God. And as a young man, he began a series of purges there in Judah. With all of the zeal and the drive of youth, he began to clean things up. Going back to 2 Kings, we read here that he went out and he did various things. In fact, in verse 3 of 2 Kings 22, we're told in the 18th year he sent servants to the house of the Lord and told them to go to Hilkiah the high priest and to begin to repair, in verse 5, the breaches of the house, unto carpenters and builders and masons, and buy timber and hewn stone to repair the house. They began the repair of the temple. Josiah launched the period of revival. He launched a period of reform. Now, as we come on down here, we will find. I'm going to take the rest of the account here in 2 Chronicles 34. That in verse 14 of 2 Chronicles 34, they brought out the money that was brought into the house of the Eternal. And Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Eternal given by Moses. And Hilkiah answered, and he said unto Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law. in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah delivered the book to Shaphan. Now, understand how bad things had gotten. Things had gotten to the point that they'd even lost the Bible. Undoubtedly, at an early time in the days of Manasseh, the priests had hidden the book of the scroll of the law. They had hidden the book of the law for fear that Manasseh would destroy it. Some faithful priest had hid it there in the temple. The temple had pretty well fallen into disrepair. It was there were idolatrous altars that were set up in portions of it. There were portions of it that were overgrown, that were disused. And it had simply ceased to serve the function for which it was designed. Josiah, as a young man, began to purge the land. He began to wipe out the idolatrous groves, and he went throughout the land and even on up into the area of Israel, where there were still some of the remnants of the 10 tribes that had not yet been taken into captivity. And he began the process of wiping out idolatrous groves and all things that pertain to idols everywhere he could find it. And he did all these things, and he began, after a while, he raised money to begin the repair and the restoration of the temple. And as they were doing so, the high priest, in going through and cleaning out some of the sacred areas of the temple that had been closed up and shut up, found the book of the law. It had been years since anyone had even had a Bible to read. There was only the knowledge of what it said that had been preserved. You know, we take for granted the multitude of books and Bibles that we have. Since the printing press was invented in the 15th century, books have multiplied. The very first book to ever be printed on the printing press that Gutenberg invented back in the mid-15th century, the very first book to ever be published was the Bible. And that was the great motivation and the great drive to make available the Scriptures. Prior to that time, the only copies of the Bible that existed were hand-copied copies. Now, you can just imagine that if the only copies available were something that somebody had set down and written out by hand, there wouldn't be a whole lot of copies available. And at this particular time, the only copy, the official copy, there may have been little portions and scraps recorded here and there, but the copy of the book of the law, which Moses had delivered to the Levites, had been hidden away and had not seen the light of day for 50 years plus. For over half a century, people had lived and died in Judah, never having seen a Bible. And Hilkiah found the book of the law, and he brought it to the scribe, and the scribe brought the book to the king. And he says, "We have found it. We found it. We knew it had to be somewhere, and we found it." So they continued the work on the temple, and in verse 18 of 2 Chronicles 34, Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." And Shaphan read it before the king, and it came to pass, when the king heard the words of the law, that he rent his clothes. He was deeply moved, because he understood how bad things were. The only teachings that he had been oral teachings. Teachings from elderly priests that had committed great portions of Scripture to memory. Teachings perhaps from his mother. Her name is mentioned significantly here. He certainly didn't get it from his father. He had heard these things, but he had never realized, never heard the whole thing. They read the book to him, and of course, as they got to the area of the blessings and cursings there in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, and he realized the seriousness of the sins as to how God looked at it. So the king commanded Hilkiah and various ones to go and inquire of the Eternal for them that are left in Israel and Judah concerning the words of the book that is found. For great is the wrath of the Eternal that is poured out upon us, because our fathers have not kept the word of the Eternal to do after all that is written in this book. And Hilkiah and they that the king had appointed went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum, who was the keeper of the wardrobe. She dwelt in Jerusalem in the college, which was the remnant of the school of the prophets. And they spoke to her to that effect. And she answered and said, Thus says the eternal God of Israel, Tell you the man that sent you to me. Thus says the Eternal, Behold, I will bring evil upon this place and upon the inhabitants thereof, even all the curses that are written in the book which they have read before the king of Judah. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense unto other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands, therefore my wrath shall be poured out upon this place and shall not be quenched. And as for the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, so shall you say unto him, Thus says the eternal God of Israel concerning the words which you have heard, because your heart was tender, and you did humble yourself before God when you heard his words against this place and against the inhabitants thereof, and humbled yourself before me, and did rend your clothes and weep before me, I have even heard you also, says the Lord. I will gather you unto your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace, neither shall your eyes see all the evil that I will bring upon this place and upon the inhabitants of the same. So they brought the word to the king again. Well, the king sent, and he gathered together the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests, the Levites, the men small and great, and he read in their ears all the words of the book of the covenant that was found in the house of the Lord. He read the Bible to them. And the king stood in his place, and he made a covenant before the Eternal to walk after the Eternal and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and with all his soul, to perform the words of the covenant which are written in this book. And all the people heard it. And Josiah, we're told in verse 33, took away all the abominations out of all the countries that pertain to the children of Israel. He didn't just stop in Judah. He went out into the territories that they used to rule, and he cleaned out them too. Much, I'm sure, to the shock and amazement of some of the inhabitants of those places, who really hadn't intended on being cleaned up. But Josiah was a man of zeal. And we're told in verse 33, all his days they departed not from following the Lord, the God of their fathers. In chapter 35, verse 1, Josiah kept the Passover unto the Eternal in Jerusalem. They killed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. He set the priests in their charge and encouraged them in the service of the house of the Lord, and the Levites. And we're told in verse 17, and the children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at that time, the feast of unleavened bread, 7 days. And there was no Passover like to that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet. From the days of Samuel the prophet. It had been 500 years since they had observed it this way. From the days of Samuel the prophet. Neither did all the kings of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah kept. And the priests and the Levites and all Judah and Israel that were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, in the 18th year of the reign of Josiah was this Passover kept. Young man, 26 years of age. Here we find an attempt at revival, an attempt at restoration, an attempt at warning. Well, we're told in verse 20, we skip a number of years. We skip down for a period of over 12 years. And we're told in verse 20 that Josiah prepared, after he had prepared the temple, Necho, the king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates. And Josiah went out against him. And we're told in verse 33, the archers shot at King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, Have me away, for I am sore wounded. His servants therefore took him out of that chariot and put him in a second chariot that he had. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died. And he was buried in one of the sepulchres of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. And Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, lamented for Josiah And all the singing men and the singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentations to this day. And they made them an ordinance in Israel. Behold, they are written in the Lamentations. And the rest of the acts of Josiah and his goodness according to that which was written in the law of the Lord, his deeds first and last, they're written in the books of the kings of Israel and Judah. Josiah died, and the whole nation mourned and lamented, and Jeremiah lamented. And we're told that these laments were made an ordinance in Israel. They were written in the Lamentations. Where do we find an ordinance in Israel? Where do we find a part of the law that is called the Lamentations? Well, we find it in the Bible. We find a book called Lamentations. We're told here that Jeremiah wrote something in the Lamentations that was made an ordinance for Israel. If you read back in the book of Lamentations, the heading, it says the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Sort of give you the indication that maybe this is what he wrote. Well, of course it is. It is a book that was written as a prophecy. Josiah was killed about 35 years, approximately, 30 to 35 years before the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. The events that took place after his death began a very quick destruction. We're told that those who took over in the aftermath of his death did not continue in his ways. We're told that when Josiah died, that his son Jehoahaz was made king in his stead. And we're told that this son only reigned 3 months. In 2 Kings 23:32 tells us he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And Pharaoh Necho put someone else in. He put a brother in as king, named him Jehoiakim. And we find that he was 25, and he reigned 11 years. And we're told in verse 37 that he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. Nebuchadnezzar finally took him captive. And we're told that when Zedekiah became king, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. Josiah was the last righteous king of Judah. One of the things we find when we look at the Scripture, whether it is the reign of a good king or a bad king, is we find that people followed their leaders. The time came when God said, look, even though Josiah has turned to me with all of his heart, and I have no problem, I find no fault with Josiah, but I'm not going to spare this land, because I do find fault with the people of the land. They may be complying with what Josiah says, but their heart is not in it. They may be outwardly complying with the things that Josiah says, but their heart isn't in it. And the fact that as soon as Josiah died, they went back to the things they used to do is a pretty good proof and indication that their heart was never in it. We're told of Manasseh that he seduced Jerusalem to sin. Now, they made choices. Ultimately, it comes down that all of us have choices to make. We are all responsible as individuals for the choices that we make. God holds us accountable and holds us responsible as individuals. We can't go through life simply saying that, well, we're just playing follow the leader. We can't use what others do as an excuse. The people of Judah and Jerusalem used the things that Manasseh did as an excuse. He did it He's king. If he can do it, why can't I? They used the things that Jehoiakim and Jehoiahaz and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, they used the things that they did and said, well, if they can do it, why can't I? After all, he's king. When Josiah was king and he insisted on certain things, insisted on reform and revival, they fell in line behind that too. But you see, God looked on their heart and He knew that it never went below the surface. They simply had an attitude to go along in order to get along. Whatever the prevailing power was, they went with it. But there was no reality, there was no substance, their heart wasn't in it. We're told of Josiah that he served the Lord his God with all his heart and with all his soul. He put his whole heart into it. Josiah did everything that he knew to bring about an in-depth revival. He knew that God is merciful. But you see, God knew something that Josiah did not know. He knew that nothing had changed in Jerusalem below the surface. Oh, there was outward conformity to the things that Josiah insisted upon. There was outward conformity. People fell in line. After all, he was king. There was outward conformity, but brethren, if there had been inner change, inner conviction, they couldn't have swapped back to the other side so quickly. They couldn't have lost what they were doing so quickly. Very, very important. Jeremiah lamented because he understood what it meant. And those few who really were committed to God understood what it meant. They understood that Josiah was the only thing standing between Judah and total destruction. That it was out of regard for him. God had respect and regard to Josiah. What difference can one man make? What difference can one person make? What difference can a young person make? I'll tell you what, teenagers, if you want a role model, Josiah is certainly a role model of a young man that made a difference. He was a young king that saved a nation. Because Judah would have gone into captivity an entire generation earlier than it did, had it not been for Josiah. But God had respect and regard for Josiah. He was impressed with Josiah's attitude. But when Josiah died, there was nothing to stand between the nation and destruction. Now, the book of Lamentations is known in Hebrew as Eikah, is the Hebrew name, Eikah, which means just literally how. That takes its name from the first word of the book as it's written, and I'm going to be reading some excerpts. I'm reading it from the Jewish translation, the Jewish Publication Society version of Lamentations, very similar to the King James. You can just follow along. It starts out in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Lamentations. How does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces? How has she become a tributary? The book of Lamentations, which is a lament, it is a lamentation, it starts out with the question, how? How did this happen? How did it come about? And it's known by that name in Hebrew, how. It's important for us to understand how. There's an interesting statement in the book of Jeremiah. This sort of sets the stage to answer the question, how. Chapter 34, verse 1, the word which came to Jeremiah from the Eternal, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, and all the kingdoms of the earth and of his dominions, and all the people fought against Jerusalem and against the cities thereof, saying, Thus says the Eternal, the God of Israel, Go speak to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and tell him, Thus says the Eternal, Behold, I will give this city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he'll burn it with fire. You shall not escape out of his hand, but shall surely be taken and delivered into his hand, and your eyes shall behold the eyes of the king of Babylon, and he shall speak unto you mouth to mouth, and you shall go to Babylon. Yet hear the word of the eternal Zedekiah, king of Judah. Thus says the Lord unto you, you shall not die by the sword, but you shall die in peace, and with the burnings of your fathers, the former kings which were before you, so shall they burn odors for you, and they will lament for you, saying, Ah, Lord, for I have pronounced the word, says the eternal. Then Jeremiah the prophet spoke all these words to Zedekiah, when the king of Babylon's army fought against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, against Lachish and against Azekah, for these defense cities remained of the cities of Judah. This is the word that came from Jeremiah unto Jeremiah from the Lord, after that the king Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people that were in Jerusalem to proclaim liberty unto them, that every man should let his manservant and every man his maidservant, being a Hebrew, go free, and that none should serve himself to wit of a Jew, his brother. And so all the princes heard this and entered into this covenant. And verse 11, afterward they turned and caused the servants and the handmaids whom they had let go free to return, and brought them into subjection for servants and for handmaids. Now, what happened, the Bible does not give the details, but Josephus, a Jewish historian of the first century, gives the details. Jeremiah had proclaimed God's message in just the final years of Zedekiah's reign, just a matter of a very short time before the captivity. And the armies of Babylon were coming. Zedekiah was scared. It was the year of the Jubilee. And Zedekiah decided that what they needed to do was to show God that they really meant business. So he proclaimed liberty through the land, was going to follow the instructions that God had given in Leviticus. Well, Josephus tells us that when the Jews started to obey, the Egyptians started up against Babylon. All of a sudden, Pharaoh down in Egypt got stirred up and decided to send an army up to fight against the Babylonians. Well, when the Jews saw this, that the Egyptians were going to fight the Babylonians, they reached a conclusion. Their conclusion was, oh, boy, we don't have to really worry about depending on God after all. The Egyptians are going to come to our rescue. We've been trying to get them to help us out for a long time. Let's forget about this Jubilee and sabbatical year. Everybody get your servants back. Let's just go back, let the good times roll, because the Egyptians are going to take care of us now. We don't have to depend on God. Well, the Egyptian army was immediately defeated in the aftermath of that, and the Jews were in worse shape than before. That set the stage for the Babylonian siege against Jerusalem. Now, you talk about short-sighted. You see, people so often have sort of a foxhole religion, a religion of convenience. They get scared, they get in trouble, they're ready to play let's make a deal. Only they want to play let's make a deal with God. And they think that somehow, God's dumb enough to fall for it. They can make him all these promises and they'll cut a deal, and as soon as they've gotten what they want, God kept his part. I don't guess I need to worry about mine. Well, it didn't work that way. God had sent a message. God's message was to be carried out. Lamentations says, how does the city sit in solitary that was full of people? How did this happen? How has she become tributary? On down in the latter part of verse 2, Lamentations 1, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. Judah is gone into exile because of affliction, because of great servitude. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her pursuers overtook her within the straits. The ways of Zion do mourn. We're told on down in verse 8, Jerusalem has grievously sinned, therefore she has become as one unclean. In verse 10, the adversary has spread out his hand upon all her treasures. He has seen that the heathen has entered her sanctuary. Verse 11, all her people sigh, they seek bread. They've given their pleasant things for food. Started spending their money and all their precious things because food was scarce. You know, gold is of little value if you can't buy something to eat with it. So it comes to pass on down in verse 14, Jerusalem is quoted as sort of personified as saying, the yoke of my transgressions is impressed by his hand. They are knit together. They are come upon my neck. They have made my strength to fail. The Lord has delivered me into their hands, against whom I was not able to stand. The Lord has set at naught all my mighty men in the midst of me. He has called a solemn assembly against me to crush my young men. On down in verse 16, the latter part of the verse, it says, my children are desolate because the enemy has prevailed. In verse 18, the Eternal is righteous, for I've rebelled against his word. Hear, I pray you, all you peoples, and behold my pain. My virgins and my young men are gone into captivity. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. I called for my allies, the ones that I depended upon, the ones that I thought I could count on, but didn't have to worry about God. Had these others that were there that were going to stick by me. They deceived me. Verse 20, behold, O Eternal, for I am in distress, my inwards burn, my heart is turned within me, I have grievously rebelled, abroad the sword bereaves, at home there is the like of death. They have heard that I sigh, there is none to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble and are glad. Chapter 2 goes on, it says, how has the Eternal covered with a cloud the daughter of Zion in his anger? He has cast down from heaven upon the earth the beauty of Israel. Verse 2, the Lord has swallowed up unsparingly all the inhabitants of Jacob. In verse 3, he has cut off in his fierce anger all the horn of Israel. Now what we find as we get into chapter 2 is that Jeremiah begins to expand this lament beyond Judah and Jerusalem to all of Israel. To all of Israel. Because you see the lament that Jeremiah took up at the death of King Josiah. The lament that he took up for the destruction that was going to come upon Judah and Jerusalem. That was fulfilled in the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar and the destruction of the temple in 587 BC, the 9th day, the 5th month. That in itself set the stage for an event that was almost identical 636 years later with the destruction, or 656 years later with the destruction of Jerusalem once again. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman armies of Titus in 70 A.D. Now in Matthew 24, when we have recorded that Jesus was walking with his disciples in the temple precincts, and they were admiringly pointing out the grandeur of the temple buildings. They were talking about, isn't that impressive? Isn't that marvelous? Isn't this a beautiful place? It was built to last. It seemed to bespeak permanence. It seemed to bespeak stability. Jesus looked at what they had, what they pointed out. And he said, I tell you, you see all these stones? I tell you, there shall not be one stone left standing on another. Now that shocked them. Their mouths sort of fell open and they kind of stared at one another and thought, what in the world is going to happen? How can that be? So as they proceeded on a little ways, as they were heading out of Jerusalem toward the Mount of Olives, they finally asked him, it doesn't say who, probably Peter. He usually was the one to speak up and voice what the others were thinking. Lord, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus began to speak to them of events that were going to happen, recorded in Matthew chapter 24. The events that saw the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D., the events that saw the destruction of Jerusalem, the siege, and all of the destruction that went with it, Jesus used as a type of the events that would set the stage for his return to this earth. And he said of the events that will set the stage for his return, he said, "For then shall be tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever again shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there would no flesh be saved alive." Brethren, that's talking of our time, the time ahead of us. The events that the Bible speaks of, that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24, is the Great Tribulation. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. was a type of the complete and total destruction that is going to come, described as the Great Tribulation, described in the book of Jeremiah as the time of Jacob's trouble. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., which took place on the 9th and 10th days of the 5th month, the anniversary of the earlier destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, those events were a type of the tribulation that is to come. The events that took place in the aftermath of Josiah's death, that culminated with the invasion and the destruction of Jerusalem, were a type of the final destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. and of the final destruction, or the destruction of Israel, in the time immediately ahead of us. Now, Judah of old, Jerusalem of old, did not look for that destruction. They didn't believe it. They didn't think it could happen to them. They had alliances. They had great things going for them. They didn't think it could happen to them. After all, they were God's people. Jerusalem and the temple is used really to typify the entire nation, all the 12 tribes. When you read the book of Lamentations, what we have to understand is we're not simply reading a poetic description of what transpired anciently in 587 BC, nor are we simply reading what took place, a prophetic and poetic interpretation of what was to take place in 70 A.D., that while that certainly is a part of the story, that is not by any means all of the story. Because the book of Lamentation reached beyond the destruction that Nebuchadnezzar wrought, the destruction that Titus and the Romans wrought. It reaches down to the times immediately ahead of us. The times when a great superpower is going to rise up in Europe. The old Roman Empire, the old Holy Roman Empire, is going to rise like a phoenix from the ashes, present itself as the defender and preserver of Western Christian civilization, and is going to proceed to plunge the world into the hellish mess that the Bible calls the Great Tribulation. A time of trouble such as has not been since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever again shall be. The book of Lamentations starts with the question, how? How could something like this happen? How? Over and over in the book of Lamentations, the question how introduces the chapter. How has God done this? How could something like this happen? In verse 2 of chapter 2, the Lord has swallowed up unsparingly all the inhabitants of Jacob. In verse 3, He has cut off in fierce anger all the horn of Israel. He has drawn back his right hand from before the enemy. He has burned in Jacob like a flaming fire which devours round about. In verse 5, the Eternal has become as an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all her palaces. He has destroyed her strongholds. He has multiplied in the daughter of Judah, moaning and mourning. He has stripped his tabernacle as if it were a garden. Describes the famine, describes the things that come. On down in verse 13, it says, "What shall I take to witness for you? What shall I liken to you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What shall I equal to you, that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? For your breach is great, like the sea. Who can heal you? Your prophets have seen visions for you of vanity and delusion. They have not uncovered your iniquity to bring back your captivity, but they have prophesied for you burdens of vanity and seduction." So Jeremiah brings out here in Lamentations 2:14 that the false prophets have been the Pied Pipers that have led the nation not in the way of repentance, not in the way of change, not in the way of deep, heartfelt turning away from sin, but they've said, hey, everything's okay, no problem. They've seen visions of vanity and delusions. They've not uncovered your iniquity. They haven't pointed out, call sin, sin. Now, you know, there are different kinds of false prophets. You have religious false prophets and secular false prophets. They're all false prophets. In fact, secularism is perhaps the single most prominent religion in our Western world and in the United States. Because the word prophet simply means one who proclaims or announces. It is one who is a herald, an announcer, a proclaimer. It would certainly be the Hebrew word that would most fittingly make reference to the media and the opinion molders of today, which can certainly include the religious false prophets, but it includes the secular false prophets as well. It includes the people who announce and proclaim to the nation, who give explanation, to whom people look for answers. In several places in the prophets, it indicts three categories of leadership: the princes, the priests, and the prophets. The priests and the prophets are not identical. The priests refer to the leaders of organized religion. The prophets have to do with those who, in our modern terms, use the media, because that's the way you proclaim or announce to the nation. Now, that can include the religious false prophets who certainly use media, but let's understand that the most influential false prophets in this nation are prophets of secularism. The point is, all of them, religious or secular, the overall grouping of them is indicted for not having uncovered your iniquity. They prophesied for you burdens of vanity and seduction. He said this is okay. In verse 19 of Lamentations 2, it says, "Arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water before the face of the Eternal. Lift up your hands toward Him for the life of your young children that faint for hunger at the head of every street." It's almost impossible for people to comprehend that these things are going to come on this nation. Verse 22, "You have called as in the day of a solemn assembly, my terrors on every side, and there was none in the day of the Lord's anger that escaped or remained." In chapter 3, verse 1, "I am the man that has seen affliction by the rod of His wrath." In verse 6, "He has made me to dwell in dark places, and as those that have long been dead." Verse 8, "Yea, when I cry and call for help, He shuts out my prayer." Verse 17, "My soul is removed far off from peace. I forgot prosperity." But verse 22 says, "Surely the Lord's mercies are not consumed. Surely His compassions fail not. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that a man should quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. In verse 30, let him give his cheek unto him that smites him. Let him be filled full of reproach. For the Lord will not cast off forever. Verse 33, he does not afflict willingly nor grieve the children of men. God doesn't do it because he enjoys it. In verse 40, let us search and try our ways and return to the Lord. Verse 42, we have transgressed and have rebelled. You have not pardoned. In verse 55, I called upon your name, O Lord, out of the lowest dungeon. You heard my voice. Hide not your ear at my sighing, at my cry. You drew near in the day that I called upon you. You said, fear not. Chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, how has the gold become dim? How is the most fine gold changed, and the hallowed stones are poured out at the head of every street? Verse 4, the tongue of the suckling child cleaves to the roof of his mouth for thirst. The young children ask bread, and none breaks it unto them. They that did feed on dainties are desolate in the streets. Verse 6, for the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the sin of Sodom, that was overthrown as in a moment, and no hands fell upon her. That's the way God views the nation. Verse 12, the kings of the earth believed not, neither all the inhabitants of the world, that the adversary and the enemy would enter into the gates of Jerusalem. They couldn't believe it, didn't believe it would happen, but it did. Well, it goes on and describes the destruction, and chapter 5 ends the book of Lamentations. It says, remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Behold and see our reproach. Our inheritance is turned unto strangers, our houses unto aliens. We're become orphans and widows. Our mothers are orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. We've drunk our water for money. Our wood comes to us for price. Verse 7, our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquity. Servants rule over us. There is none to deliver us out of their hand. Verse 11, they've ravished the women in Zion and the maidens in the cities of Judah. Verse 14, the elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. The joy of our heart is ceased. Our dance is turned unto mourning. Our crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us, for we have sinned. In verse 19, you, O Eternal, are enthroned forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. Wherefore do you forget us forever and forsake us so long a time? Turn you unto us, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. You cannot have utterly rejected us and be exceeding in wrath anger against us. So this was the lamentation that Jeremiah wrote in the aftermath of Josiah's death. It was a lament that is echoed down through the centuries. It was a lament that foretold the destruction and the calamity that the people of Judah brought upon themselves in Nebuchadnezzar's invasion. 6 centuries later, in the destruction under the Romans, or the Roman destruction under Titus. But both of those events simply prefigured events of which Jesus spoke in Matthew 24, a time of great tribulation. Brethren, what set the stage for these things? How could all of this come about? Because the people never turned in their heart to God. Oh, when the pressure was on, they outwardly conformed. What we have to understand very deeply in our hearts and minds, and an important lesson that we can glean from this book, is that God is after something that goes far deeper than external conformity. God is after an inner transformation and change. What's important to you in your life? Where are your values? on what do we set value? Josiah, as a young man, turned to God with all his heart and all his soul. He was a young man that put his heart into seeking God. There was nothing Laodicean, half-hearted, or lukewarm about Josiah. There were no halfway measures that Josiah took. Josiah didn't seek to meet sin halfway. He didn't try to compromise with the world around him. He didn't try to go just a little of the way and see if maybe God would sort of meet him part way. Josiah stood out in the history of Israel and Judah as a king that sought to God with all his heart, who turned not aside to the right hand or to the left, but he walked in the ways of the Lord. God postponed the destruction of an entire nation because of one wholehearted, righteous young man, young ruler. But the people, though they may have outwardly conformed with Josiah's reforms, never changed anything in their hearts. Brethren, we need to examine our hearts. Not simply to follow the example of Judah that outwardly conformed to Josiah's reforms, but to follow the example of Josiah himself, who turned to God and served God with all his heart, no halfway measures, no compromise, all the way. These things are here for our admonition. We're living in the age that is going to see the fulfillment and the culmination of all of the things of which the Scriptures speak. We had better put our attention and take heed to these things, so that when these events come to pass, we will, as Jesus said, if we are watching and praying always, that we may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that are going to come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man.